So, one of the favorite criticisms of those who attack the Bible is that Christians just made it up. Just plain made it up. They copied ancient myths. They copied ancient desires. They confused all these Greek myths and Judaized them. And so that's how you get Christianity. One of the common examples that is offered by critics is the Greek god Serapis. Serapis' idol was common in Greece before and after the time of Christ. You look at the image and, well, some people compare it to Christ. Some people have the idea that this Serapis, who is said in one myth to have possibly died, and then later, in later myths, he's alive. So, resurrection before Jesus, yay! It's about 300 BC when Serapis is made a god of the Greeks by Ptolemy. The ancient Babylonians worshipped Serapis, or ideas of Serapis, 400 BC or so. And if you look at 500 BC, well, there's ideas that perhaps Serapis came even from Africa. It's really highly disputed. The history of Serapis, one of the big stories with Serapis is that as an idol whose image was unknown to the Greeks, it was brought to the Greeks and they didn't know who it was, so it was the unknown god. Well, that unknown god, that image, was actually Serapis. And it was the image of Serapis that Paul would encounter at the Areopagus. In Acts, the 17th chapter, he sees an idol. And there's an inscription on the altar to an unknown god. In all probability, the idol to the unknown god that Paul saw, in all likelihood, was an image of Serapis. And it would be this image of Serapis that Paul would use polemically to explain to the Greek people, we need to worship Christ, who is the God unknown to the Greeks, but is the true and living God, worshipped by the Jews, acknowledged by the Jews, proven to be real by the Jewish prophets through prophecy, through miracles, through signs, and established by eyewitnesses in the time of Paul, in the time of the men of the Areopagus, who they could still get on a boat and go to Jerusalem and talk to Jews and say, hey, dead man Jesus, did he come back alive? Yeah, we saw him here in Jerusalem. He appeared on a hill to 500 of us, plus our women and children. 500 men, women and children. Not 500 men, women, and children, but 500 men and women and children on top. We know Jesus is alive, that he is the resurrected God of the Jews. Yeah, some of our Pharisees, the rulers, they're resistance, but we know he's the Messiah. Christianity was spreading like wildfire throughout ancient Judea. And it was common knowledge that Jesus had to be real because so many people saw the historical Jesus actually factually rise from the dead, and rather than deny that reality, they would rather die because they had facts. They had evidence that, hello, Jesus is real, and you can't make me deny what my eyes saw. I know that this is real. But what about Serapis? What about the idea that he was a dying and rising God? Well, first of all, you look at the myth and it's hazy. You don't have this crystal clear picture that he died. And so in later accounts, when he's talked about being alive, you aren't necessarily talking about a dying and rising God. You know, how many hundreds of times have we watched television shows where you think the hero died, but no, he's alive. You know, it happens. Fiction is fiction, so why confuse it with reality? But like we said, the ancient texts of Serapis, possibly from Africa around 500 AD. Let's give the critics the benefit of the doubt and say that, okay, Serapis is a resurrection myth. Does that mean that the resurrection myth predates the Judeo-Christian heritage? Absolutely not. The prophet Daniel clearly talks about the resurrection of the dead in the 12th chapter of Daniel's book. That's a concept that's going to happen to everybody, specifically in Isaiah 53. The prophet Isaiah talks about how the Messiah would see the light of life after he dies for the sins of the world. So Christ will come, he'll die for the sins, for the iniquities that we pierced him with because of our transgressions. He died for our wounds. He dies for the guilt that we deserve as a guilt offering for us. And then he sees the pleasure. He'll see it and be satisfied. And by the knowledge of Christ, he will justify many. That's all of us who believe in Jesus. And that is written in 700 BC, 200 years before the earliest myths of dying and rising gods from the African or disputed African, disputed Babylonian sources of Serapis. But, you know, we know that the Messiah is going to be the mighty God, born King of the Jews, born the Prince of Peace, the Wonderful Counselor. So you have this idea of a dying and rising God, this dying and rising Messiah from Isaiah in 700 BC, predating the earliest, absolute earliest accounts of Serapis by 200 years. Clearly, this idea of resurrection, which even the prophet David, King David, the prophet David, talks about in Psalm 16, talking about how the Holy One, the Messiah, will not see corruption. He will not see the death corrupt his body, so that the resurrection is a concept that's clearly enumerated in the Old Testament as what will happen. So if anybody copied anything about dying and rising gods, it was the Greeks that got the idea from the Jewish conception of what would happen to the Messiah. Just saying. If anybody copied, it wasn't us. But the idea of the Messiah was not always crystal clear in the minds of the Jews. I'll talk about it more in length at another point about how the Jewish leaders saw Jesus perfectly fulfill the requirements for the Messiah, and then they changed their conception of what the Messiah is. The idea in Jewish circles is that, okay, you have a tree in a forest and you see, boom, bullseye. Perfect bullseye. This arrow shot into a tree. And you're walking, you see another arrow shot into a tree. Another bullseye, perfect bullseye. 7, 8 trees go by. You see bullseye after bullseye after bullseye. And you're thinking, wow, this guy must be a wonderful shot. And then you come across the marksman and you see him shoot an arrow into a tree and then paint a bullseye around the arrow so that it looks like he hit a perfect bullseye. Is that what the Christians did? You know, they saw Jesus do such and such, and then they changed everything so that it looks like it fulfills it. Actually, historically, what you see when you look at the ancient documents, you see that Jesus perfectly fulfilled their conception of what the Messiah would be. And then the target got moved after the fact. So it looked to the Jews like he missed. But that's a discussion for another day. As interesting as it was. But what of this idea that Jesus is like the white version of the black African Serapis? Does that have any bearing on reality? Absolutely not. We've already looked at how the idea of resurrection predates the Greek culture within Jewish prophecy. However, the idea of a historical figure like Christ being ineligible to be true because of a previous fictional story is just, it's absurd. It really is absurd. It'd be like saying Barack Obama could not be president of the United States because I watched a movie called Deep Impact, and in it Morgan Freeman played a black president, so therefore it's fictional, the idea that a black man's president, and so therefore Obama cannot be president of the United States. It's absurd. It's utterly absurd to say that a historical reality like Christ cannot be true because a previous myth sounds something like a historical development that happened earlier. Early Christian apologetics didn't have a problem with people trying to say that Christianity copied ancient myths because nobody thought that a historical person would be copied from fictional stories that might have sounded similar. Actually, ancient Christian apologetics, ancient Christian thinkers, specifically I'm thinking of Augustine and his City of God, his Civitate Dei, wrote that the Greeks really shouldn't be killing us for having such strange ideas when our ideas sound so similar to your ideas, except he went on to explain how dumb the Greek ideas were, and they are. You know, the ancient idolatry is as dumb then as it is now, and as dumb as all other wrong and idolatrous ideas about God. But ancient apologetics actually emphasized the similarities. between old mythology and the contemporary Christian truth, because they wanted to say, look, you're killing us for believing in a dying and rising God. But then they would stretch mythical stories like Isis and Osiris and Serapis and say, look, why are you killing us for believing in Jesus when you yourselves believe in something similar? Of course, we worship a historical reality, and you guys are holding to a fictional story that even your own priests say isn't reality. Even your own ancient pagan priests didn't proclaim the myths as a real life event. They were fables, they were myths, never meant to be taken seriously. The Jesus of history is meant to be taken seriously and should be taken seriously, because people would die rather than deny the reality of what Jesus did for them on the cross. Oh, and when he rose from the dead, there were eyewitnesses, and we have many of those eyewitness accounts of his resurrection preserved for us today in Matthew, Mark, John, many of them in Acts. Eyewitness accounts of the resurrection are preserved for us throughout the epistles of Paul the Apostle. We have marvelous secondary sources, men like Luke, who went around interviewing the eyewitnesses and compiling factual evidence of what took place surrounding the life of Jesus the Messiah, who is the real and living God, who exists in reality, who not only exists in reality, but God who created reality, the God who created you and me, the God who you and I are going to be accountable to someday. And if you have not yet accepted Jesus as your personal Lord and Savior, I'd invite you to do that today. Because sooner or later, you're going to find out that Jesus is true, that Jesus is real. I just pray that you find out and accept him as your Savior before you find out and discover him as your judge.